All right, well, thanks everyone so much for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate your being here. Just want to make sure folks know this program is being recorded, and we'll post this up on the OHS website for educators to refer to in the future. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones. I'm on the team at the Oregon Historical Society, where I also edit our journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, and I'm really excited for this afternoon's talk by Kenneth Coleman. So we want to appreciate our sponsors. The PGE Foundation, Oregon Parks and Recreation, and Oregon Heritage Commission has funded a whole series of work that we've been doing to engage with educators on the curriculum and resources that we have at OHS. In particular, the curriculum that's related to our Experience Oregon exhibit. We know folks haven't been able to bring students to the museum over the past year, but we look forward to the time when you will be again. And in the meantime, we have, and after then also, we have really incredible curriculum and resources on our website that you can use to help teach Oregon history, regardless of whether you're visiting the Oregon Historical Society. So we really appreciate the work of sponsors in helping us to present workshops like this one to help connect educators to those resources that we have at OHS. We always want to begin our programs taking a minute to acknowledge that wherever we are in Oregon, or indeed anywhere in the Americas, we're on Indigenous land. So I'm here in Portland, which is located on the homes of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Guatemala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and the many other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. What you see here on the screen is a map of language groups crossing over what's now known in the geographical boundaries of Oregon, and also stretching up north and south and east of there. This is in our exhibit, Experience Oregon. We always encourage folks to take time to learn about Indigenous communities from the communities themselves. Here in Oregon, we have 9 tribes that are recognized as such by the federal government, and there are other tribes in the state as well. Many, if not all of them, have incredible resources on their websites. We have 3 museums, Chichalu, Temastlik, and the museum at Warm Springs, that folks can go visit to learn about Indigenous history here in Oregon. And our grades 3 through 5 curriculum that goes with Experience Oregon is also connected very deeply to Indigenous history and culture in Oregon, and it's crafted at this point to be aligned with the Tribal History Shared History curriculum that's come out of SB 13. So we encourage folks to use that in your classrooms as well. We are excited to say that we're open this week. We have limited hours from 12 to 5 this week through Sunday. After that, we'll go back to weekend hours from 12 to 5 until further notice, when we'll be expanding more into the weekdays as the COVID numbers continue to go down, and as safety continues to look good. So we encourage folks to come on in and check us out. We've been really grateful to have wonderful visitors coming in. Everybody's observing all the mask rules and the social distancing rules, and we're really happy to have folks coming into the exhibits again. So please join us at OHS whenever you feel comfortable and able to do so. We are hiring right now at OHS. We're hiring for a youth history writer. This person will be responsible for research, writing, and revision necessary to create a 4-part history series for 3rd grade readers. This is modeled on a publication from the early 1990s that is due for revision. And we're really excited to have this opportunity working with Portland Public Schools to create these readers. We're looking for somebody who has appreciation for and knowledge about Indigenous knowledge and perspective, someone who is appreciating and eager to craft something that will align with the new ethnic studies standards that the state of Oregon has adopted, and somebody who is eager to jump right in and craft some work on a tight timeline, and then continue to work with teachers through the next academic year on feedback and revision. So if you or someone you know might be this person, please take a look at the application and apply soon. We're reviewing applications and beginning to schedule interviews soon. If this work sounds of interest to you, but you can't take on the job and still want to be involved, we would encourage you to consider applying to be a part of our teacher advisory group. And if you are interested in that, you can email education@ohs.org And we will send you the little form that you can fill out to apply to be on the teacher advisory group. And thanks to everyone for your interest in this. Today's presenter is Kenneth R. Coleman. He is a graduate of Portland State University. He teaches at Portland Community College. He has a couple of fantastic publications out. One is the book Dangerous Subjects, James D. Saules and the Rise of Black Exclusion. It was the winner of the Francis Fuller Victor Award for General Nonfiction at the 2019 Oregon Book Awards. It's a great book that brings you through in much more expansion some of the history that he'll be talking about today. It's a really smooth read. I definitely encourage it. He also wrote an award-winning piece for the Oregon Historical Quarterly's special issue on white supremacy and resistance, looking at the Oregon Donation Land Act. And that article is up on our website, so I'll put a link to that in our chat as well. And we are grateful to have Ken here for the presentation. He'll do a presentation and then I'll pop back on to help facilitate the Q&A, and we'll be able to use the chat. And then also at that point, we'll invite you to turn on your microphones if you want to just speak out loud a question or suggestions about how you can bring this into your classrooms. But between now and then, we would ask folks to remember to keep your microphone silenced just so we can keep out the background noise. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ken. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me to the Oregon Historical Society. I really appreciate this opportunity, especially to talk to educators. I teach at PCC, where we have a really wide range of students there. So this is something I'm very passionate about, is how to communicate these kind of ideas that I think are really important to as broad a group as possible. So I'm going to right now share my slides. So hopefully this will all go according to plan. All right. From the start. Can everyone see that? All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Great. Let me make sure I also open up the chat so I can see. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is racial exclusion and the law in pre-statehood Oregon. I tried to make this as narrow a topic as possible. So we're really going to be talking about legal racial exclusion prior to Oregon becoming a state. And most of what we're going to be talking about is specifically Black exclusion, because that's how actual racial exclusion laws really manifested themselves. So, okay, for some reason perfect, okay. So I wanted to just begin with three questions, three basic questions that I hope by the end of this presentation that I've answered. If I haven't answered these questions, please take me to task in the Q&A. So the first question is, why was racial exclusion and Black exclusion in particular so persistent in early Oregon history? This Black exclusion in Oregon is more strange than you might think. There was no real indication at the time of early Anglo-American settlement that Black people, free Black people, were going to migrate to Oregon in any sort of significant numbers. But you see this persistence of Black exclusion legislation through kind of every stage of Oregon legal development. The second question is why and how did local, territorial, and federal governments forge and maintain Black exclusion in Oregon? As a historian, I'm always interested in the whys and the hows. So we're going to cover both of those. And as you can see, there were local Black exclusion laws, territorial Black exclusion laws, and I'm going to argue even federal Black exclusion laws at work in Oregon. Later on, there's going to be state Black exclusion laws, but we're just going to touch on that briefly in this talk. Finally, the third question is, in what sense was racial exclusion in Oregon unique or exceptional versus the rest of the country? I'm sort of a Pacific Northwest historian, an Oregon historian, I guess by trade, and we're kind of prone to a certain kind of exceptionalism. I mean, we wouldn't study this history if we didn't think there was something exceptional. But at the same time, I'm going to insist that we have to put these racial exclusion laws within a larger national context. So that's one of my goals in this presentation as well. And before I go any further, I just kind of want to talk about my style as an educator. I'm not a real names and dates type of history teacher. I think those tend to go in one ear and out the other. I think chronology is important. It's important to put the Civil War before Reconstruction. It's important to put the Gilded Age before the Progressive Era. I mean, these things are important, but I'm more interested in the things that I think students come away with, which I think are larger themes, larger contexts, even just what words mean. I think I always spend a lot of time just talking about what words mean. To me, it's something that I always struggled with, to really understand what did this word mean at a certain time versus what this word means now. So that's just sort of my my style as an educator. Okay, so again, I want to begin with one of these big themes. I want to begin, and I'm going to spend more time on this slide than any other slide in this presentation, because I think if there's a glowing crystal in the cave to really understand racial exclusion, it's really understanding settler colonialism in Oregon. So we kind of begin this talk in the 1840s. And this is a time in which the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, which at this time encapsulated modern day Oregon, Idaho, Washington, part of Montana, British Columbia. It's a huge region as we begin. But this is an area completely transformed by colonial contact. It had been, by the 1840s, you would have a half a century of colonial contact between Euro-Americans and Indigenous people in the region. So that's just where we need to start with that understanding. I'm also going to argue, and I make a big deal about this in my book, I think Oregon's really interesting because you have three forms of colonialism, distinct forms of colonialism in Oregon that are present at the same time and are often in conflict with one another. You have mercantile colonialism in the form of the fur trade. You have religious colonialism in the form of missionaries, and you have settler colonialism, which I'll get to in just a bit. But before I go any further, what's colonialism? It's another one of those words that gets thrown around. This is how I define it. It's when a foreign group or entity, foreign group of people enter into an area with the intention of establishing a colony, some sort of home away from home, in an attempt to gain power or control over the people and or resources of that area. So it's a tactic of imperialism in which a colony is established. Now, the classic form that you probably have in your head, or that students might have in their heads, of what colonialism is that what I call mercantile colonialism. It's the British in India. It's the Dutch in Indonesia. You can think of the French in the sugar islands of the Caribbean. Oftentimes this sort of colonialism is done by companies, like joint stock companies coming into an area to command the labor of indigenous people there and try to extract resources from that area that they can then bring back to the colonial center, or what we call the metropole. So another purpose of this kind of colonialism is also to open up new markets, but that's why I call it mercantile. It's very much about markets, and that's very much present in Oregon at this time with the fur trade, and we'll get to that in just a bit. We also have religious colonialism in Oregon. Particularly, we have Protestant and Catholic missionaries in Oregon. These are people who represent some kind of religious organization, and they're here to convert indigenous people to a specific religion or a sect or some kind of denomination. But that's religious colonialism. And I think what unites both of those is there's some place for indigenous people within these two colonial schemes. There's definitely uneven power relations here. There's definitely forms of exploitation, but there's something different about settler colonialism. I'm going to argue it's radically different, or fundamentally different, perhaps. That's when foreign settlers actually come to an area with the intention to live there permanently. And with missionaries or these companies, oftentimes it's not necessarily seen as a permanent colony. It could be an extraction colony, it could be a religious colony, it could be seen as maybe temporary, that you might end up leaving the colony at some point. The colonizer might leave the colony. But in settler colonialism, that really doesn't happen. While these settlers are there to certainly to exploit natural resources, I mean, they're there for some kind of economic gain. They're not there to command the labor necessarily of indigenous people. Lorenzo Versini is a historian of settler colonialism, and I think he puts this very well, that when he says that what makes settler colonialism different from other forms of colonialism is that in other forms, like a mercantile colonialism, the colonizer comes in and says, hey, you, work for me. I have this work that needs to be done, or trade with me. The settler colonist basically says to the indigenous person, you go away. So it very much, the indigenous person becomes an other, really, someone who has no place in this sort of settler colonialist scheme. All right, I should be. So another way I talk to students about this is a form of copy and paste colonialism. It's very conservative in this sense. Settler colonists usually aren't trying to reinvent the wheel. They're not trying to create a new kind of society. They're really trying to reproduce whatever society they came from, almost kind of an ideal version of their original home. They're trying to reproduce it in a new way. So it's almost like copying and pasting text onto a page. But the point I want to make, and I think it's something to think about when Eliza gave the land acknowledgement. Oregon wasn't a blank page in 1843 when the Oregon Trail migrants arrived in large numbers. So suddenly there's a new project here that needs to take place for the settler colony, and that is it's a form of ethnic cleansing that you see time and time again. And I think that logic of removal, of erasure, can help us understand both Indian removal, which I'm not going to talk too much about today, but it's the same logic that's behind Black exclusion in Oregon as well. It's this logic of removal. So I want to talk a little bit about what was the Willamette Valley like prior to what I call Americanization. That sort of happens in 1843. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, there we go. It's a mercantile colonialist scheme in the Willamette Valley pretty clearly. This illustration I actually got from the Oregon Historical Society. This is a sketch of Fort Nez Perce from the early 1840s, and we can kind of see this society at work here. This is a fur fort. We see looks like indigenous women doing some form of labor. We see other indigenous people doing some form of trading. To the left, we see trappers, fur trappers. I think the man in the middle might be some sort of fur trader. But the fur industry in the Willamette Valley created a different kind of Oregon with a different trajectory. Yeah, I mean, it could be a very violent place. It could be a place of exploitation, but these fur traders didn't come in with an army. So oftentimes it was a place of accommodation. They couldn't necessarily command the labor of indigenous people with military might or with numbers. So it's always a place of accommodation in Oregon at this time and elsewhere. It's a sparsely populated, multi-ethnic community. Again, there's French Canadians, indigenous people, and I should say from all over the country. It wasn't only indigenous people from the Pacific Northwest. You would have indigenous people from the East Coast coming out to work in the fur industry as well. You'd have Brits oftentimes holding the higher positions in these fur companies. You would have Pacific Islanders, many of whom came to the region on ships from the Hawaiian Islands, and also people of mixed ancestry. You see all these people together. Many of these trappers ended up marrying indigenous women and having families with them, which then creates a very kind of a very different community, a Willamette Valley with a different trajectory. And as I said, this is a byproduct. This community is a byproduct of mercantile colonialism. So this brings us to 1843 and the Great Migration. It's called the Great Migration of 1843, which is really when the Oregon Trail migrants arrive in Oregon. Prior to the fall of 1843, the Anglo-American population in Oregon was very small. There was a few scattered settlers, and most of them were Protestant missionaries, particularly in Salem, in Oregon City, and then east of the Cascades. But then suddenly, so this is a sparsely populated area, and almost overnight in May of 1843, well, actually they arrived later on that year, but in early 1843, you have the first major wagon train of the Oregon Trail leaves Independence, Missouri for Oregon. So there's 900 people who are pretty much going to show up all at once and sort of change Oregon, the face of Oregon forever. Who were these people? Well, there's a picture of, that's Independence, Missouri at about the time they would have been leaving. So that's kind of the world that they're going to want to copy and paste over that fur trade world that we saw. So it's a very different kind of a world. Most of the migrants, the overlanders, were very young. They were young families, most of them Anglo-Protestant farm families from the old Northwest, which is, this is the new Northwest, but back in those days, the Northwest was what we now call the Midwest: Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, as well as the so-called border states, which kind of lie between the North and South. These are our slave states, but they're not exactly part of the South. They sit on the border, and that would be Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So unsurprisingly, the Missouri actually had the most migrants coming to Oregon of any state or territory. It makes some sense because that's actually where the wagon trains were leaving from. But that's going to be important. So at the same time, this wagon train is making its way, its 2,000-mile journey across the Great Plains. People in Oregon are aware that this is going to happen. Some are excited about it, some are upset about it, but they have work to do. So they decide to form a provisional government. This is really a government that's designed to establish and protect private property, in particular land. It's important to recognize that Oregon wasn't part of the United States at this time. It wouldn't be part of the United States until 1846. What's happening in Oregon is this uneasy arrangement between the United States and Great Britain that they're going to occupy in joint occupation the area basically to extract most is just to extract furs. That was sort of the why the arrangement came to be. The Columbia River becomes sort of the rough boundary. North of it is sort of the British part. South of the Columbia tends to be the Anglo, seen as the American part of Oregon. So that's an important thing. So this government is just spontaneous. People are, it has no, it's not enshrined in US laws at all. It's just people getting together and forming a government. What this government did do was it provided free 640-acre land to settlers to claim without any kind of formal survey. So these would probably just be marked by some sort of markers, any sort of markers to say, this is my land, and then you would record it with this provisional government. The laws of Oregon were based almost verbatim on the laws of Iowa Territory. Somebody brought a law book with them on a wagon train, and this is part of that copy and paste colonialism I'm talking about. They just basically said, well, we're not reinventing the wheel, let's just use Iowa's laws. Interestingly enough, Iowa didn't ban Black immigration at this point. They later would ban free Black people from coming to Iowa. So at this time, the provisional government didn't have Black exclusion on its books. The government did ban slavery, which was completely, I mean, that wouldn't have surprised anyone because the 1820 Missouri Compromise had been established. Anything north of the southern border of Missouri was understood to be free soil. Anything south of that was understood to be a place where slavery could legally be practiced. The provisional government did restrict citizenship to white males only. This image here is from the Oregon State Capitol, the famous Champouy meeting, and you get some sense, I don't know how accurate any of this is, but the makeup of this group that formed the provisional government, fur industry workers, retired fur industry workers, and some Anglo-American settlers and missionaries were basically the three groups that were vying in a pretty controversial process over who would control the future of Oregon. So talking a little bit, I just mentioned that the government was anti-slavery, but right now I just want to I want to draw a very sharp distinction between anti-slavery politics, the likes of which Oregon boasted, and abolitionism. They're incredibly different. Even though they sound the same, they're incredibly different. Abolitionists, for the most part, called for an immediate and unconditional end to slavery everywhere that it was being practiced. And they usually called for some form of racial equality and some form of Black citizenship. Oftentimes abolitionists, well, interestingly enough, oftentimes they call for gender equality as well. So these are people like Frederick Douglass, would be a famous Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips. These were abolitionists who were calling for an immediate end to slavery. They had a moral objection to slavery, oftentimes based on evangelical Christianity. Anti-slavery is very different. It's an economic objection to slavery. It's not a moral objection to slavery. Most anti-slavery advocates are white supremacists who do not believe in Black equality. Many of them believe that Black people, if freed, should be removed from the United States in some sort of colonization scheme. So they object to it as an economic system. They don't believe it's a good economic system that benefits ordinary citizens. This will later become known as the Free Soil Movement. So in essence, for them, the idea of a nation of free labor really means free white labor. They don't see free Black people as really having any kind of place in a free labor system. This is going to become important to really understand the logic behind Black exclusion. Anti-slavery advocates, they didn't they really had no problem with slavery continuing to exist in the South. This is, I refer to this sometimes as a NIMBY form of anti-slavery. It's like, slavery's fine, just not in my backyard. Don't bring slavery here. But if you want to keep doing slavery where you are, we can quarantine that to the South, and that'll be fine. I mean, this is very much Abraham Lincoln's position on slavery for most of his life up until 1863, when history kind of turned him into an abolitionist. But I mean, he was very much a part of this sort of free soil anti-slavery politics that are going to really dominate Oregon politics. Most Oregon Trail migrants were anti-slavery Jacksonian Democrats. What does that even mean? Is that a contradiction? You know, these are followers of Andrew Jackson, the seventh president of the United States, who was famously pro-slavery and a slaveholder himself. But there was a definite strain of Jacksonian anti-slavery politics, and many of the Oregon Trail migrants belonged to this strain of politics. Jacksonian democracy was fueled by something called the agrarian ideal, which goes back to Thomas Jefferson. And it's the idea that the perfect United States would be dominated by self-sufficient farm families that owned their own farms. And this is a real pre-industrial model that somehow survives industrialization in this free soil movement. But the sense is that this would create a more egalitarian nation. If the nation is just self-sufficient, freeholders, you have free labor, there's no slavery, and you have equality. If everyone's a small landholder, no one really has more than anyone else. And you also, the idea is you don't need that much government. You just need sort of limited government. This is supposed to be a leveling idea. But this is very, very important idea that fuels many people during this period we're talking about. Jacksonian Democrats, they were, as I said, egalitarian, anti-elitists. They hated any sort of elites. They were against federal banks. They were against any kind of government infrastructure programs, against taxes, against urbanization, really against industrialization in many ways. They were against tariffs, kind of protectionist economic schemes. They didn't like corporations, which were at this time would be government chartered corporations. These were seen as privileges that certain people were being granted. And interestingly enough, a lot of them didn't like the Southern planter class. They saw it as a kind of elite that created a stratified slave economy in the South, in which white laborers really couldn't catch a break in that sort of system. So this is how, I guess the point I'm making is that anti-slavery politics and Black exclusion go hand in hand in Oregon and elsewhere as well. For Oregon settlers in particular, slavery and the presence of free Black people in their midst, they felt it would violate their vision of Oregon as a white man's country. And that's a term you see in sources over and over again. If they had any kind of a vision for Oregon, it was really as a white man's country. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and actually talk about Black people in Oregon at this time. There were only a handful of Black people living in Oregon in, let's say, 1843, 44. And by handful, I've seen estimates around 12 or 13 people in all. Most of them were sailors or former sailors. That's why I put that picture on the left. That's from a little later than this period, but I think it's important to recognize that during the period we're talking about, at the antebellum United States, the maritime industry was the #1 employer of free Black men in the United States. And The sailing ships leaving the East Coast would have maybe as much as 20 to 30% of their crews would be Black. So most of the Black people in Oregon would have come on sailing ships, maybe dealing with the fur trade or Navy expeditions, but that's how most Black people who were in Oregon got here to begin with. On the right there, however, that's Mary Jane Holmes Shipley Drake, and that's a picture from far later than when she arrived in Oregon. She actually arrived in Oregon as a 3-year-old, as the property of a slaveholder. And Gregory Noakes has written a book called Broken Chains that I recommend, but there were slaves in Oregon. We're not going to talk too much about that, but settlers tended to turn a blind eye to actual slaves. So they were against slavery, but somehow having slaves in Oregon wasn't quite as much of a problem. They're usually referred to as servants. This leads us now to the incident that really directly predates the first Black exclusion law we see in Oregon, and that's something called the Saules picket dispute that occurred in May of 1844. Now, I wrote a whole book about James D. Saules, so I'm going to try to make this very brief, but just to put this dispute into context, earlier in the spring of 1844, you had a riot break out in Oregon City between a band of Native men, most of whom were Malala, and a group of townspeople. And this was the one thing that people were terrified, these settlers who had arrived, they were terrified of something like this happening. So this riot ends with one Native man dead, 2 settlers dead, and just a sense of dread kind of overtakes the Willamette Valley. Just a couple months later, actually less than a couple months, I think about 6 weeks later, you have this man, James D. Saules, is arrested for inciting a group of Clackamas natives against a white settler named Charles E. Pickett. Now, James D. Saules was a sailor. He had deserted a naval expedition, the Wilkes expedition. He had deserted this expedition and came to Oregon, settled here, married a Native woman, and was living in Oregon City at the time. We don't really know the details of what was going on, but he is arrested and convicted of inciting Clackamas natives against a white settler. And again, this occurs in this atmosphere of fear and anxiety in this nascent settlement. He's quickly convicted by an all-white jury. There's no chance he's going to get anything like a fair trial, and he's handed over to the Indian agent, Elijah White, which really the only supposed federal power in the area. The law enforcement just didn't know what to do with him, so they gave him to the Indian agent, Elijah White, and he ends up exiling him to an area near modern Astoria, Oregon. So sends him out to the mouth of the Columbia. And after he does this, he writes a letter to the U.S. Secretary of War, basically asking, hey, we're having problems here in Oregon. Can we just ban all Black immigration to Oregon? He writes this letter saying, is this something that we can do? Is this possible? Well, we don't know if the Secretary of War ever responds to that letter, but what we do know is that this man pictured there on the left, Peter Burnett, who was a provisional government legislator. He was part of that Great Migration of 1843. He was later the first governor of California, the state of California. Gregory Noakes has a book about him as well. So a lot of promotion for Gregory Noakes today. But what Peter Burnett does is he amends the anti-slavery law in the provisional government to ban any further immigration of Black people, enslaved or free. So you can see that anti-slavery and Black exclusion are being legally tied together in Oregon. This is known as the Lash Law, and the reason why is because the punishment for being Black and staying in Oregon was public flogging. So I think it's between 20 and 39 lashes of a whip for this crime. And if you don't leave in 6 months, they do it all over again. This was soon, a few months later, they changed the punishment to some sort of strange form of indentured servitude. So it is kind of odd that forced labor is the solution to slavery in the region. We can maybe talk about later why that would have been changed from flogging to indentured servitude. This was a time when these sort of physical punishments were starting to go out of vogue. In early America, most punishments were some form of mutilation, physical damage done to a body. This is after the reform era of the 1820s and 1830s that's starting to go out of style. So that might have been why they changed the law. Oregon's Black exclusion law is then repealed in 1845. You get a new legislature comes in and they repeal it. And I think what this tells us is these Black exclusion laws are somewhat controversial. Even though almost everyone in Oregon, white people were white supremacists, people were not wholly 100% in favor of Black exclusion. I mean, it seems a majority was, but there were always opponents to this. It was always contested, and certainly at the national level, it was seen as somewhat controversial. So let's talk about the national level, Black exclusion in the United States. That was one of the questions I wanted to talk about. Black exclusion in Oregon was not exceptional. You could find Black exclusion laws of various types in every corner of the antebellum United States. You find them in the North, you find them in the South, you find them in the Midwest, and you find them in the border states. And they're usually a little different. They're intended for different purposes. Because most of the migrants came from the Midwest, that's what I want to focus on. What were these people thinking with Black exclusion? Peter Burnett was from Missouri. What was he thinking? Most of these Midwestern states were not far from slave states. Missouri was a slave state, though where Peter Burnett was from was in the western part of the state, where slavery wasn't as common as in the southern part of the state. And the idea was to prevent runaway or emancipated enslaved people from settling in the area. They wanted to prevent this from happening. They envisioned that particularly if slavery was ever outlawed, or if there was mass emancipation, that this would lead to social unrest as they saw it. Oregon residents, again, like Peter Burnett from Missouri, knew how divisive the issue of slavery could be. This was a time in the United States of constant mob violence, and particularly in Missouri, there were all sorts of violent mobs running around. So they knew how divisive this issue of slavery could be. And again, in their minds, they're viewing free Black people and slaves as, in essence, the same thing. That this is part of this racial binary that somehow in their minds that the natural condition for a Black person was a position of servitude. So they would just sort of fall into slavery wherever they happen to find themselves. Most proponents of such laws believed free or fugitive Black people would form a dangerous and permanent underclass. And these people are obsessed with this kind of white egalitarianism. So free or enslaved Black people will violate this vision of white egalitarianism. In May of 1846, the United States and Great Britain, after nearly going to war over who would control Oregon, they enter into a treaty where they basically settle the boundary between Oregon and British Canada at the 49th parallel, which is now the current border between the United States and Canada. So now Oregon is officially part of the United States, but it's not yet an organized territory. That will have to wait a little bit. Oregon becomes an organized territory in 1848 in the wake of the 1847 Whitman incident, in which a group of Cayuse men killed the Presbyterian missionaries Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, as well as 11 other settlers, really in retaliation for what they saw as them not preventing the spread of disease, the spread of measles through this area. So they saw this as an act of resistance. The settlers certainly didn't see it this way. It explodes into warfare, really the first major war between local settlers and an indigenous community, in this case, the Cayuse, in the Cayuse War. So this was really the reason why Oregon wanted to become an organized territory, so that they would have that kind of protection, military protection, federal troops, federal garrisons, that kind of support. So Oregon becomes a territory at this point. Now, what does this have to do with Black exclusion? Well, Oregon, unsurprisingly, reaffirms its ban on slavery. But then they also, in 1849, pass a new Black exclusion law. This time, it really focuses on Black sailors, and it focuses on captains of slave ships and how they need to deal with their Black crew members and prevent them from leaving the ships, prevent them from deserting the ship. So it's putting the onus on these captains in many instances. But the rhetoric around it is all about the danger of Native Black collaboration. The speeches people make in favor of this law, they repeatedly talk about the danger if you allow Black people to come to Oregon. They will start to collaborate, they'll mix with indigenous populations, they'll cause all sorts of problems, they'll threaten the safety of the settlement. This is a deep, deep idea in US history. And actually something similar had happened in the Seminole Wars just earlier, right before the Oregon Trail. In fact, there were migrants who had fought in the Seminole War, in which Seminoles and escaped slaves and then also mixed race people fought against the US government in a very long quagmire of a war. So that's sort of the context of this second Black exclusion law. I'm going to talk about another, this is a federal act, a federal act of Congress that I'm insisting we have to look at as another, as a racial exclusion law that works within a web of laws in Oregon, and that's the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act. So what did this act do? In late 1849, Samuel R. Thurston, who was the territorial delegate to the US Congress, meaning he was kind of like a congressman, except he couldn't vote, but he could kind of influence the proceedings. He could be in Washington, DC. He could really lobby. I mean, that's really kind of what he ended up doing. So he introduces his bill known as the Oregon Donation Land Act that he wants to get Congress to pass. This is a land reform act. And land reform had a long history in the United States. It's the idea that the government would give land. That's what the government had, a lot of land at this time, especially due to the Louisiana Purchase and other forms of land, massive government land claims. The idea is that the government would then give small claims out to settlers on which they could farm. So this is very much tied in with that agrarian ideal. It was seen as a win-win for the government. They would get this armed vanguard of settlers going out into the West, where the country didn't have a big military at this time. And then you also now have kind of a nation of small landowners, which was seen as more egalitarian than what was developing in the industrial Northeast at the this time. So that's sort of the land reform starts as this very egalitarian movement. But in Oregon, it ends up being a very significant means of racial exclusion. And this is really due to the tireless lobbying of Thurston and the support of Oregon politicians and many Oregonians themselves. This Oregon Donation Land Claim Act will work in conjunction with the later removal of Indigenous communities to reservations. This actually gets passed first before any treaties are even negotiated. This land is basically given away. So what did it do? I included this image here because what's an acre? I mean, for us in the 21st century, we don't really think in these terms anymore. And I always like students to try to conceive of what is an acre? And I mean, it's just a little less than a football field in size. So what did how much land did this Donation Land Claim Act actually give away? It could be anywhere between 160 and 640 acres, depending on the timing. It was more generous if you got in early, then it was kind of diminishing returns as the act went on. You also got more land if you came as a married couple. You could get as many as 640 acres early on if you came to Oregon as a married couple. So this is an inducement to settlement, to bring settlers out to Oregon. Who gets this? Well, according to the act, every white settler or occupant of the public lands, American half-breed Indians included, which I think that's a concession to that fur trade world I talked about before. You had to be over the age of 18 years. You had to be a citizen of the United States, or you made some kind of declaration that you intended to become a citizen. So you can really see whiteness here is primary, even more so than nationality. So some of the people in Oregon who weren't even from the United States or US citizens could actually get land claims, but someone who had lived in the region all their lives, or a Black person born in the United States, a Chinese person, would not be who intended to become a citizen, you would not qualify for these incredible giveaway of free land. And I've really, in my article, I borrow a term from Ira Katz Nelson, who was writing about the New Deal. We're talking about this really is an affirmative action program for white people. And I think it's the best way to really understand what this meant. Pictured above is actually, that's Cedar Mill, which might be familiar to some of you, certainly is familiar to me. But we see the land claim. This is the interesting land claim map, and we can kind of see how these land claims interlocked, how people were able to claim this land. We see certainly a lot of married couples here, and it's the married couples that are claiming the very largest plots of land. What's really interesting to me about this, for many reasons, and I talk about this in the article, is this enshrines all of those land claims the original settlers made before Oregon was even part of the United States. So when they made these land claims without any kind of official surveys, they got this land. It was theirs. And this was land that was illegal according to U.S. precedent and U.S. law, because this, according to U.S. precedent in the Northwest Ordinance, was kind of set this idea: if you took any land, if a settler took land, they first had to extinguish what was called Indian title, that you had to enter into some sort of treaty with the local tribe. A private citizen couldn't buy land from an indigenous person. That was not legal according to U.S. law. But here was a way it got grandfathered in. People were able to claim these lands and then get the feds to enshrine them. So this is a public-private partnership between the government, the federal government, and private people in Oregon that transfers lands that had been held in common by Indigenous communities for millennia. Again, the federal government did this without treaties with these communities. The treaties would come later, and that's a whole other story. So why does this matter? Why am I talking so much about this law? This is a picture of Portland in 1859 celebrating statehood. From 1850 to 1855, over 7,000 people claimed 2.5 million acres of Oregon land. And Oregon's population rose from around 12,000 to 50,000 by 1860. So this led to a pretty remarkable population growth. Granted, it's still not that many people. This is during the gold rush, so a lot of people were headed to California rather than go to Oregon. Many people in Oregon actually headed to California. So I still think it's pretty remarkable that you see this much population growth in Oregon, and I think you can tie it directly to this Donation Land Claim Act. It also made Oregon's population big enough that they could even entertain the idea of statehood. You're supposed to have 100,000 people in a territory to become a state. Oregon didn't. They still managed to become a state. But this Land Claim Act, this inducement to settlement, made it possible to become a state. But only white people could claim this land. So at the same time, you see Oregon's Black population in the same time frame grow from 50 in 1850 to 124 by 1860. Now, granted, these are census figures. We don't know how accurate they are. We don't know how much the census takers were interested in recording the Black population. We don't know how much the Black population would have been interested in being recorded, considering that there was a Black exclusion law on the books at this time. These Black exclusion laws, though, only affected future immigration. Black people living in the area were allowed to stay. But we can see a very different scale of population growth. And again, the Donation Land Claim Act is the most general federal land act in U.S. history. Nothing really comes close to giving out this much land. And it's also the only one I've found that explicitly employs racial exclusion. So if we're talking about Oregon exceptionalism, there you go. I mean, I think that's really interesting that Oregon has the most generous land reform act in U.S. history and the only one that employs racial exclusion. In 1849, the 1849 Black exclusion law that I described when Oregon became a territory was accidentally repealed in 1854. Nobody really knows why. It was a clerical error. But suddenly this law is repealed and Oregon no longer has a Black exclusion law on its books. The territorial legislature is a little concerned with this, and they introduce Black exclusion laws in both 1855 and 1856. And interestingly enough, both of them fail by huge margins. So this is really interesting. I think one of the reasons why they failed is because Oregon was looking at becoming a state, and no free territory had ever become a state with Black exclusion on its books. And Oregon was already treading on thin ice with 50,000 people and becoming a state. And I don't think they wanted anything that would gum up the works in the US Congress, anything that would slow down their becoming a state. But that's just one reason. When they actually debated it, most lawmakers, and we're talking some of the most openly racist lawmakers you could imagine, they considered the law basically unnecessary because they said the Donation Land Claim Act had done the job of Black exclusion already. It had made Oregon incredibly discouraging to Black immigration, because you already had one population that had taken up all the good land, and there wasn't much left. They also argued most Black people were going to go to California, and they're pictured there as a Black miner in California. That was their idea, that this Donation Land Claim Act had kind of done the job that Black exclusion was supposed to do. It actually done it more effectively. So what does this mean moving forward? In 1857, Oregon voters, in a unique move, overwhelmingly voted to include Black exclusion in the new state constitution, where it would remain until 1926, even though in essence it was rendered illegal by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. But as anybody who's studied the 14th Amendment knows, that a lot of things that violated the 14th Amendment were allowed to continue. It doesn't mean that necessarily Black people were being excluded during that time, but it certainly set up an atmosphere in which they wouldn't have felt welcome in Oregon. In fact, the population growth of Black people from 1860 to World War II remains flat at about 0.21% of the population were Black during this period of time. That's not 2%. That's 0.2% of the population, and that remains flat until you get to World War II, where there's a huge demand for labor and a population boom throughout the entire West, in which you have major migration of Black people coming to the West to work in the wartime industries. And that's a talk for a whole other day. But what does emerge from this is sort of very much Southern style Jim Crow segregation. This picture here, also from the Oregon Historical Society, is from the Kenton neighborhood of Portland, probably around the 40s. And this is something you might associate with the Jim Crow South, but no, this was Portland during the 1940s. So I'm going to this is the last slide, and we're basically done with this presentation. I just kind of wanted to keep the last slide a little open-ended, just to give you things to think about. I think that the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act and how it works with Black exclusion, it foreshadows how racial exclusion and racial segregation would work in Oregon moving forward, in the form of restricting access to real estate and housing, and that really being an ongoing means of exclusion and segregation. I really think this Land Claim Act is sort of, it foreshadows what's going to come next. I do think we can draw a line from the Donation Land Claim Act to 20th century practices like redlining, in which communities of color, Black people, Chinese people, were only allowed to purchase homes in very small, limited areas, various real estate covenants that people are constantly finding. Many people who are moving into houses now in Portland are finding that the deeds to their homes have all sorts of racist language. I know that PSU has been involved in a project to try to collect all of this information. But I think we can draw a line from this to all these sort of forms of housing discrimination, certain kinds of zonings. I think you can also look at gentrification as a form of settler colonialism, if you really want to. I think that might be an interesting topic as well for students to think about, is how these deep structures persist, and kind of this legacy of inheritance. Finally, this is a remarkable fact I learned a couple of years ago, that 60% of the world's assets are held in real estate, property. Real estate is wealth. And you think about how Oregon started out and how certain communities got an enormous advantage. And there's a real legacy of inheritance with that kind of advantage, where land and real estate can be passed along generation to generation, just as those who didn't get access to that, there's a legacy of inheritance as well. So I think that's where I'm going to end my presentation, and then we can open things up. I'm going to stop sharing right now.
Thanks so much, Ken. That's an incredible statistic, that 60%. It's really interesting. Well, we're eager to hear folks' questions, and also, you know, happy to have, oh great, here's a question right here. Briefly, how does Oregon's racial exclusion history compare to that of Washington State? Can you speak to that, Ken?
A little bit. So Washington becomes a state in, it becomes its own territory in 1853 and becomes a state later on. I don't think there's anything comparable in Washington. Washington is basically populated much later than Oregon. It's really, in many ways, a 20th century place in terms of sort of Anglo-American settlement. But interestingly enough, as I mentioned before, the Columbia River used to be the old border between the Brits and the Americans. And from the very earliest days, Black people would oftentimes move north of the Columbia River. That was seen as a safer place to be. The guy I wrote about, James D. Saules, went up there. George Washington Bush, who's another very famous Black settler who actually came on the Oregon Trail, he went north of the Columbia. So that did tend to be a place where people went, Black people went, rather than be south of the Columbia River in the Willamette Valley. I see some other, should I just start answering these questions?
Yeah, I think go for it.
Okay, so what happened that led to the repeal of the Black exclusion provision in the state constitution? Well, that was 1926, and that's a great question. I was actually wanting to research on this, or I encourage anybody. I think this would be a great research project for students in particular, because you'll be able to, I'm sure you can find out what was going on in 1926. The vote was pretty close. I was shocked. I guess I shouldn't have been shocked, but I think only 60% of Oregonians voted to repeal Black exclusion in 1926. So I assume it was a ballot measure, right? Like in the Oregon system, probably a ballot initiative, but I don't know that for sure. But that would be something great for someone. If a student is looking for something to research, I think that would be something very doable and something really, really interesting and productive.
I'll just jump in and say I think that would be super interesting, because there were so many KKK supported ballot measures in the 1920s that passed. So an alien land law, a literacy test for voting rights, and then this Black exclusion overturned. But of course, it wasn't enforceable after the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So,
which I think, and that's true, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have symbolic power. I mean, I think that's how these laws really work. They weren't enforced that much, but they were very powerful in terms of their symbolism and how they projected power to people here. Was the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act ever challenged in the courts? It was certainly challenged in the courts. In terms of the whiteness provision, I don't know of any specific cases. I do know that when Congress was debating it, there were a lot of senators and congressmen, certainly from the North, sort of what would have been called conscious Whigs or Republicans, who had real problems with it. And so it was debated. It was somewhat controversial. The law still got passed. There were court cases, I think, involving, there was one involving, I think, an Indigenous woman who managed to get land from the Donation Land Claim Act, I think when her Anglo husband died. She was, I think it's in my article. It's been a long time, but I do remember a case like that. Did the Donation Claim Land Act affect Chinese immigration in the late 1800s in the same way it affected Black populations? Well, it certainly, as the 1850s went on, Chinese immigration became a concern in Oregon and throughout the entire West. And it was debated to ban Chinese people in the state constitution. They did make a lot of anti-Chinese laws in the Constitution, but they didn't actually ban the immigration. But as you might know, in 1882, the United States banned Chinese people, Chinese immigration in general, the federal law in 1882. As far as, oh yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I think there was a ban on Chinese land ownership in the Oregon Constitution. So
yes,
yeah,
the Donation Land Claim Act was done by then. It ended in 1855, so that wouldn't affect it. But yes, but in terms of owning property, so let's say a Chinese person wanted to buy somebody's land, they wouldn't have been able to do it legally in Oregon at this time. A Black person wouldn't have been able to legally, even if they had the money to do it, to legally purchase this land. What else? Yes, somebody asked, what did the Saules picket dispute have to do with racial exclusion? Was Saules Black? Yes, Saules was Black, and I should have been more explicit in that. But yes, James D. Saules was Black. So the fact that you had a Black man joining together with a group of Native men against a white settler was kind of an explosive situation in the Willamette Valley. I should mention, I wrote extensively about Charles E. Pickett, the man on the other side of this dispute, who was very famous, ended up being a very famous person. He was a rare thing in Oregon. He was actually a genuine Southerner. He was from Virginia. He was a cousin of George Pickett, if you know your Civil War history of the disastrous Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg. That was his cousin. Charles E. Pickett was a white supremacist who later became a political gadfly in California. So hopefully that, yeah, that was a detail I probably should have made more explicit. So asks, another question here is, there were a number of later land acts for homesteaders. Did they also include Black exclusive language? No. The next major land reform act was the famous 1862 Homestead Act during the Lincoln administration. And this only got passed due to Southern secession. So suddenly, you know, this becomes a bonanza for Congress, and they can pass all sorts of stuff they could never pass before, because the sort of the Southern politicians who very much were aligned with the planter class weren't going to pass. There was no way they were going to get a land reform act that was going to restrict slavery in any way in the West. So in 1862, it's a different situation. The Homestead Act doesn't have Black exclusive or racial exclusive language. It does talk about citizenship. So Black people weren't citizens after the Dred Scott decision. Roger B. Taney in 1857 declared that Black people couldn't be US citizens. But then the 14th Amendment restores the idea of Black citizenship. So Black people were technically able to get homesteads according to the 1862 Homestead Act, which again, it's a whole different context when that law is passed. Another question, what was the disease connected to the Whitman massacre? I believe it was measles. My understanding is that it was a measles epidemic that had been imported from California. And Marcus Whitman was a physician. He was a doctor, and he had been treating indigenous people, though the Presbyterian missionaries had having less and less contact with the people they were supposed to be working with as missionaries, but he was treating people. So there was a sense that either he wasn't effective in his treatment, or that he might have been intentionally spreading the disease among the Cayuse, is my understanding. We have another question about Pierce versus Community of Sisters. I think that's a question of whether the repealing of Black exclusion in 1926 had something to do with Pierce versus Community of Sisters, and I believe that was the Supreme Court. Is that the Supreme Court decision about religious schools, private schools, right? That was a Klan-backed initiative to ban private schools in Oregon. It certainly, I don't know, was connected, but it certainly would have been that same exact time period, right in that same period. It's fun to get questions that I can actually. So as you know, as teachers, you get these questions that oftentimes really generate wonderful things when you can't answer them. But I also feel good when I can actually ask questions. Let's see here. I think I just lost. Okay. Chinese labor knew where the best gold claims were located. Yeah, well, mining really comes to Oregon in the 1850s. I mean, mining fever just grips the West after the gold rush. And indeed, if you Chinese miners were coming from a region of China where I believe they'd been silver mining for generations, so they really knew their stuff in a way that a lot of the miners who were coming from the East Coast had no idea what they were doing. So there was certainly always a lot of jealousy and antipathy based around that dynamic in the gold fields of California and indeed Oregon, as you see a lot of violence and massacres. Oh, okay, yes, thank you. So Eliza, you have the reference to Letitia Carson, yes, and she very famously had her own homestead claim in the 1860s. Governor Pierce was a Klan member. Yeah, I mean, that's in the 1920s. It's a different Ku Klux Klan. The second, they come back as a different kind of an organization. The Reconstruction era Ku Klux Klan is definitely a terrorist organization to try to end any kind of idea of Black citizenship or Black political participation in the South. But the new Klan that really comes to Oregon is trying to be like a mainstream political organization, really trying to make inroads in mainstream politics. So yeah, you had all sorts of alliances between local politicians and the Ku Klux Klan. So I have a question here. Okay, so Black exclusion got accidentally repealed. That's true. Then failed to be reinstated. That's also true. Then got into the Constitution. That's actually, there's an interesting story behind that, where there were two items that they refused to debate at the state constitutional convention. They managed to write a constitution and get it passed in 2 months, which is pretty remarkable. And they did this by anything controversial, they just decided to kick to the voters. So they weren't going to talk about slavery and they weren't going to talk about Black exclusion. They would just kick that to the voters. So wouldn't kind of, again, gum up the work. So that's sort of how, so then the voters overwhelmingly, 90%, I think, something like that, voted to have make Oregon a Black exclusion state, which is the only free state that ever came into the Union with a Black exclusion law on its books. A lot of other territories would have them, and then they get rid of them as they were going to become a state, or they become a state and then bring them in later on. But Oregon is sort of unique in that regard. Then Oregon was one of the first states to ratify the 14th Amendment, then repealed its ratification all within 20 years. Why all the back and forth? Were there changes in who was in office? Yeah, I mean, I think there was. I mean, Oregon was interesting politically at this time, just between the sort of the rise of the Republican Party, and there were all sorts of different Republicans. There were real free soil, white supremacist Republicans, and then there were more, I don't think progressive's the right word, but maybe more aligned with some of the more radical Republicans at the time. You really see those sort of political jockeying between the Democratic and Republican Party. Also, different regions. I mean, the state was very diverse as it is now. There was a real urban and rural divide. The southern part of the state was very much informed by, southern, had far more of a southern feel than the northern part of the state. Portland itself, the urban areas had far more influence of the Northeast. Many more people living in Portland were from New England or the Northeast than you would find in rural areas. So I do think I think that might explain some of that back and forth. So another question, did the lands designated from tribal relocation in Oregon in the 1880s take into consideration the possible location of gold claims in an attempt to preserve these lands for mining? I do know that mining caused a lot of problems as miners were fanning out throughout Oregon. I can't really, I'm not really qualified necessarily to answer that question, but certainly in the 1850s, there was attempts by Anson Dart and then Joel Palmer to get treaties done and then get them ratified by the Senate. Some of them took a long time to get ratified. I don't really know the question about the 1880s. I do know, I mean, by then I think we're sort of, that period is, I mean, that's after the Nez Perce War. So, but I do know that again, the Nez Perce, one of the problems that they dealt with in that period was because people thought there might be gold on their land. So you suddenly have miners going into their land, and then the feds are saying, hey, we got to protect you from the miners, so we're going to send federal troops out, and then that this causes all sorts of problems. So question, I understand that the vote on Black exclusion garnered more votes than the approval section on statehood itself. Yes, that is true. More people voted for Black exclusion than voted for it to have an actual state constitution. More people voted for Black exclusion than to make Oregon a free state as well. So yes, Oregon voters were bound and determined to enshrine Black exclusion in that state constitution. Okay, I have another question. Where can I find examples of speeches that demonstrated fear of Indigenous and Black alliances? Well, Samuel Thurston has some. If you look at some of the rhetoric that he employed in Congress, and that's kept in the Congressional Globe, you can find that language there. I think I include some of it in both my book and the article, so that's a good place to go to find the exact source for that. Another great source is George H. Williams's Free State Letter. George H. Williams was a judge from Oregon who later became U.S. Attorney General and almost became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But in the 1850s, he wrote a letter to the Oregon Statesman, I think it was the Oregon Statesman, one of the big newspapers, basically explaining why Oregon shouldn't become a slave state. And he talks about, look at what happened in Florida with the Seminole. You can't allow Black people and Indigenous people to get together. So those are just two examples, but those are probably the two most prominent I can think of. Okay. Oh, thank you. Yes. Great. Any other questions?
All right. Those are great questions.
Yeah, they were.
Suggestions. Someone also put in the chat the link to Temasilit, which is the museum that is crafted by the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation. It's a great museum, and they also have resources online. So thank you, Kathy, for putting that link in the chat. They're a great resource, particularly around history of the Cayuse and the Whitmans and that sort of thing. My understanding is that Cayuse tradition was often to kill healers or doctors if they weren't successful. And so,
Yes.
which Marcus was well aware of for many years
Mhm.
before his death. So thanks very much, everyone. We'll send out a follow-up email, and we will ask folks to give feedback on the session. And also that's what you'll use if you'd like to get your 2 PDU credits for this. So we really appreciate everyone for providing feedback on this, and also would love to get you your PDUs. Thanks, Marsha. I'm glad this has been fantastic. Thanks all of
Yes,
you very
me too.
much. We
It's
really
weird doing
appreciate it.
this. Sorry. No,
No, go
it's
ahead.
great having this feedback, because I mean, you have no idea if there's any, you assume there are people out there, but it's always good to get that kind of feedback.
It's very true. It's very true. Well, we appreciate all of you. We know, teachers, you're in the midst of yet another change in how you're going about your work, as you have been for the past year. So thank you for all you're doing. We really appreciate you, and please keep in touch and let us know what else we can do to support you. And thank you very much, Ken. We appreciate this. Have a good
Thanks for
afternoon,
having
everyone.
me.
Good evening.
Thank you.
I love the clapping. That's great.